I want you to picture a very specific scenario for a second. Just imagine you were sitting down to read the Bible, right?
Okay.
And you get to the very end of the Old Testament. So maybe you're, reading the book of Malachi. Or if you're looking at the traditional Hebrew ordering, you're just finishing up the Chronicles.
At the very end of the scroll.
Exactly. You read that final lingering prophetic word, and then you just physically turn a single incredibly thin page. Boom.
Just one page.
Yeah, one page, and you are in the New Testament. You're suddenly in the Gospel of Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow in the space of that one single page turn, literally everything in the world has completely changed.
It's honestly jarring. Because if you read the text straight through without really understanding the chronology, it feels as though the universe just experienced this massive unannounced software update, while you were turning the page.
That is exactly how it feels. Because, you leave a world that is centered around, like, Persian imperial toleration.
Yeah.
You have a struggling, partially rebuilt temple, and these ancient Hebrew prophets delivering these soaring poetic oracles. And then you flip the page, and suddenly you are looking at a world utterly dominated by Romans.
Romans everywhere.
Right. And Greek is the common language being shouted in the streets and marketplaces.
Mm-hmm.
People are intensely arguing in these local community centers called synagogues.
Which didn't even exist in the Old Testament.
Exactly. They're just suddenly there. And there are all these new, heavily entrenched political and religious factions walking around, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians. You look at this landscape and you just have to wonder, what on earth happened in the space of that one-page turn?
Well, for a very long time, the traditional shorthand for that page turn, especially in, various Protestant traditions, has been to just label it the 400 silent years.
The silent years, right.
Yeah, and the underlying assumption in that phrase is that, well, between the prophet Malachi and the sudden arrival of John the Baptist out in the wilderness, prophecy simply ceased.
Like God just hit mute.
Exactly. That God went completely quiet and the historical clock just sort of paused in the dark. It suggests this vast empty waiting room before the New Testament could finally start.
Which sounds incredibly dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at the sources we've gathered for this deep dive, they suggest that framing is not just a little off. It's actually fundamentally backward.
Oh, it's entirely inadequate. While it might be a convenient shorthand to describe the cessation of canonical Old Testament prophetic books, calling this era silent completely misses the reality of the ground-level history.
Right.
The core thesis we really need to grasp today is that this period, which historians and textual scholars broadly prefer to call the Second Temple period or the era of early Judaism, was not silent at any point.
Not even a little bit.
Not at all. If anything, it was a period of deafening noise. It was chaotic, bloody, fiercely intellectual, and just deeply transformative.
So that is our mission for this deep dive. Together we are going to explore the mechanics of that transformation. We want to understand how this era was actually a crucible.
And a massive crucible.
Yeah. We are going to unpack how the geopolitical map, the linguistic landscape, and the theological framework of the ancient world were sovereignly prepared for the coming of the Messiah.
And we're pulling from a pretty extensive library of sources here.
Oh, yeah. We've got archaeological excavation reports, ancient historiography, apocryphal literature, socioeconomic studies of the ancient Mediterranean, because we want to demonstrate to you that this roughly 400-year window is not a gap.
Definitely not a gap.
It is the crucial load-bearing bridge between the promises of the Old Testament and the fulfillment found in the New. We basically need to figure out the mechanisms of how the Old Testament world actually mutated into the world Jesus was born into.
Well, to understand that mutation, we have to start with the geopolitical reality of the land of Judea itself.
Okay.
We need to look at the massive tectonic shifts in global power that occurred while the prophets were supposedly silent. Because, Judea isn't just an isolated patch of desert.
Right, it's not just out in the middle of nowhere.
Exactly. Geopolitically, it is essentially a narrow land bridge connecting 3 distinct continents. You've got Africa, Asia, and Europe.
The ultimate crossroads.
Yeah. So if you are an ancient empire and you want to move troops or trade goods or just secure a border between Egypt and Syria, you literally have to march right through Jerusalem. It is prime, heavily contested real estate.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Imagine you're living in a small, resilient border town, right? But this isn't just any border town. It's situated right on the only viable highway between 2 massive warring superpowers.
A very dangerous place to live.
Exactly.
Right.
And it feels like every 3 or 4 generations, your town is completely overrun by whoever won the latest global war.
Right.
And you aren't just getting a new flag on the mayor's office. The new empire brings their own economic system, their own required languages for legal contracts, their own educational systems. It's like this operating system that you are being pressured to download.
And if you don't download it, you are rendered entirely incompatible with the world around you.
Yeah, you just get locked out.
The concept of an imposed operating system is incredibly apt for what historians call the parade of empires. Let's look at the mechanics of this imperial conveyor belt.
Let's do it.
The timeline essentially kicks off around 538 BCE. The Babylonians, who had, destroyed the first temple and exiled the Jewish people, have just been completely routed by the Persian Empire.
Enter Cyrus the Great.
Exactly. The Persian king, Cyrus the Great, implements a completely new mechanism for managing his conquered territories. Because instead of the Babylonian method of mass deportation and cultural destruction, Cyrus utilizes a policy of imperial toleration and repatriation.
Which was pretty revolutionary for the ancient world, wasn't it?
It was brilliant. He figures out that a happy, localized population that is allowed to worship its own gods is much more likely to pay its taxes and not rebel.
So he actually funds and permits the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the Second Temple.
He does, and this Persian period, which stretches for a couple of centuries, is generally characterized by a relative degree of administrative tolerance. The Jewish people are a subject nation, yes, but they have a localized autonomy.
Centered around the high priesthood of Jerusalem.
Right. But geopolitics never remains static. The tectonic plates shift violently in 333 BCE.
Oh, man. 333 BCE. This is the arrival of Alexander the Great.
It is indeed.
This is the young Macedonian king who basically conquers the entirety of the known world before he even hits 30 years old. I mean, he just sweeps through the Levant on his way to crush the Persian Empire.
Like a tidal wave.
Yeah, but he's not just bringing phalanxes and cavalry, right? He's bringing an entirely new cultural paradigm.
He is. Alexander is driven by this almost evangelistic zeal for Hellenism. And Hellenism isn't just the Greek language. It is a comprehensive, totalizing cultural package.
What does that package actually include on the ground?
Well, it encompasses Greek philosophy, Greek architectural ideals, civic organization, polytheistic religious syncretism, and a specific focus on the physical perfection of the human body through the gymnasium.
So when Alexander conquers Judea, he integrates it into this vast Hellenistic network.
Exactly. Suddenly, if you want to be anyone of consequence, like if you want to trade across borders or defend your property rights in an imperial court, you have to speak Greek and participate in Greek civic institutions.
If you want your kids to have any upward social mobility, they have to go to the Greek schools.
Precisely.
So the pressure to assimilate isn't necessarily a soldier holding a spear to your neck, at least not initially.
No, not at first.
It's economic. It's social FOMO. If you don't adopt the Hellenistic operating system, you are essentially locked out of the global economy.
And that economic and social pressure only intensifies after Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE.
Because he dies super young and leaves no clear heir.
Right, so his empire just fractures. His leading generals, known as the Diadochi, carve up the known world into competing kingdoms. So for the next century, roughly 305 to 198 BCE, a dynasty known as the Ptolemies, who based their empire down in Egypt, managed to consolidate control over the Judean land bridge.
Which means the Jewish people are now tethered politically and economically to Hellenistic Egypt.
Yeah, and Alexandria becomes a massive hub of Jewish life.
But the Ptolemies are constantly fighting with another Greek dynasty, right? The Seleucids.
Yes, the Seleucids, who are based up in Syria, they fight a series of conflicts known as the Syrian Wars, and Judea is the literal battleground. They're just marching back and forth over it.
The poor border town just getting trampled again.
Right, exactly. Finally, around 200 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus III definitively defeats the Ptolemies and seizes control of Palestine. So Judea changes hands once again.
And from what I see in the sources, the Seleucid approach to the Jewish people was fundamentally different than the Ptolemies or the Persians.
It was a drastic shift.
Yeah, it shifted from a sort of passive, economically driven cultural drift into this highly aggressive, coercive operation.
Yeah.
Why did the Seleucids care so much more about forcing the Jewish people to be Greek?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the broader geopolitical pressures the Seleucids were facing. By the early 2nd century BCE, there is a new, terrifying superpower emerging in the West.
Rome.
The Roman Republic. Rome is expanding rapidly, and they actually defeat the Seleucid forces in a massive battle in 190 BCE.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they force the Seleucids to pay a crippling financial indemnity. The Seleucid Empire is suddenly desperate for cash, and they are desperate for internal unity to hold off this Roman threat.
So they look at their empire and they see this strange, distinct pocket of Jewish people in Judea.
Right. People who don't eat the same food, who rest every seventh day, who refuse to worship the state gods.
And who have a massive treasury sitting in the Jerusalem temple.
Exactly. It's the perfect storm of imperial desperation.
Yeah.
They need money, and they need conformity.
And this brings us to the tipping point. Because the cultural pressure crosses the line from subtle economic influence into violent existential threat. We are introduced to a Seleucid king named Antiochus V, who takes the throne in 175 BCE.
Yes.
And he calls himself Epiphanes, which means God manifests, which tells you a lot about his ego.
Oh, absolutely. Antiochus V, Epiphanes, is the catalyst for one of the most severe traumas in Jewish history. He decides that the distinctiveness of the Jewish people is a direct threat to the unity and stability of his fracturing empire.
You can't handle the nonconformity.
Right. He doesn't just want political subservience anymore. He demands absolute religious and cultural assimilation, and he uses the sword to get it.
How far does he actually go? Because the sources describe a level of persecution that sounds almost systematic in its attempt to erase an entire culture.
It was entirely systematic. Antiochus issues royal decrees that effectively outlaw the fundamental practices of Judaism. He makes it a capital offense to own a copy of the Torah.
Just to own the book.
Just to possess it. He bans the observance of the Sabbath. He explicitly outlaws circumcision, which, for the Jewish people is the foundational physical sign of the Abrahamic covenant.
The sources mention some incredibly horrific details about that, too.
Yeah, it's gruesome. Mothers who circumcised their infants were executed with their babies hung from their necks. He sets up a military garrison right in Jerusalem to enforce all this.
Just constantly terrorize the population.
Exactly. And then in 167 BCE, he commits the ultimate unthinkable sacrilege.
The desecration of the Second Temple.
Yes. The historical sources, including the books of the Maccabees, recount that Antiochus stripped the temple of its gold and its sacred vessels. But worse than the theft, he erected an altar to the Greek god Zeus Olympios right on top of the great altar of burnt offering in the temple courtyard.
Right, where they were supposed to sacrifice to Yahweh.
Exactly. And then he ordered the sacrifice of unclean animals, specifically pigs, on that altar. In the apocalyptic literature of the time, this is referred to as the abomination of desolation.
It's hard to overstate how devastating that would be. You have a people whose entire worldview revolves around the concept of holy space.
Right, the temple is the center of the cosmos for them.
Exactly. It's where heaven and earth intersect. It is the sole location where atonement for sins can be made. And now it is not just destroyed, it is actively, perpetually defiled by pagan sacrifice.
It was a calculated, profound spiritual trauma designed to break the psychological and religious will of the Jewish people.
So when Antiochus pushes this far, does the entire nation just fold under the terror? How do the Jewish people respond to this systematic erasure?
The response is anything but passive. Antiochus severely miscalculated the depth of covenantal loyalty among a subset of the Jewish population. He basically ignited a powder keg.
Where does the pushback start? Because it isn't in Jerusalem, right?
No. Jerusalem was heavily garrisoned by Seleucid troops. The resistance begins out in the rural countryside in a small town called Modin. The narrative centers on an elderly rural priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons.
The sources paint such a vivid picture of this inciting incident. The Seleucid imperial officers arrive in Modin.
Right.
They set up a pagan altar right in the town square, and they demand that the prominent citizens step forward, offer a sacrifice to the Greek gods, and eat the sacrificial meat to prove their loyalty to the king's decree.
A public loyalty test.
Exactly. And they specifically target Mattathias, offering him wealth and status if he just sets the example for the rest of the town.
Mattathias' response is a defining moment of zealous defiance. He publicly declares that even if every other nation in the king's dominion abandons the religion of their ancestors to obey the imperial decree, he and his family will not deviate from the covenant.
But it doesn't stop with just a nice speech.
No, it doesn't. Another Jewish man steps forward, intending to comply with the decree and offer the pagan sacrifice to save himself.
And Mattathias just snaps.
He is consumed with zeal for the Torah. He rushes forward, kills the compromising Jewish man right on the altar, and then kills the king's royal commissioner. Yeah. He tears down the pagan altar, shouts for anyone who is zealous for the law to follow him, and flees with his sons into the rugged Judean wilderness.
That is the spark. That is the exact moment the cultural tension explodes into an all-out holy war. I mean, they don't have an army, they don't have funding, they just run to the hills.
It's the birth of a guerrilla resistance.
Exactly. When Mattathias dies shortly after initiating the revolt, the military leadership of the rebellion falls to his third son, Judas.
And Judas proves to be a military prodigy. He is given the surname Maccabeus, which most scholars believe derives from the Aramaic word for hammer.
Judas the Hammer, which is just an incredible historical nickname.
It really is.
But practically speaking, how does a ragtag group of priests and farmers fighting in the hills actually contend with the Seleucid Empire? I mean, the Seleucids had professional standing armies, heavy infantry phalanxes, war elephants.
War elephants, yes.
How did the Maccabees survive, let alone win?
It comes down to mechanism and terrain. Judas Maccabeus understood the geography of Judea perfectly. The Seleucid heavy infantry relied on flat ground to form their massive, tightly packed phalanxes.
Right, they need an open field to maneuver all those spears.
Exactly. So Judas simply refused to fight them on their terms. He utilized the steep, narrow wadis and mountain passes of the Judean hill country to launch devastating ambush attacks.
Just hitting on where they couldn't turn around.
Yeah. He would attack the Seleucid supply lines, strike their marching columns at their absolute most vulnerable points, and then melt back into the hills before the heavily armored Greeks could properly deploy.
Asymmetrical warfare at its finest.
It was brilliant. Over the course of 3 years, through a combination of this asymmetrical warfare and, frankly, the distraction of internal political turmoil back in the Seleucid capital, Judas actually defeats several large imperial armies sent to crush him.
It is a stunning underdog victory. And it culminates in 164 BCE when Judas and his forces actually fight their way back into Jerusalem. They take control of the Temple Mount.
They do.
And I think it's really telling what their first priority is. They don't immediately set up a political throne or start minting coins. They go straight to the desecrated sanctuary.
Because their priority was purity. They find the temple gates burned, the courts overgrown with weeds, and the sanctuary completely defiled.
The sources say they were weeping when they saw it.
Yes. The texts tell us they carefully dismantled the defiled altar of Zeus, and they actually stored the stones away because they didn't know what to do with them. They couldn't throw them away, but they couldn't use them.
Right.
So they built a brand new altar out of uncut stones, precisely as the Torah commanded. They crafted new holy vessels, burned incense, and lit the lamps. And on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, in 164 BCE, they joyfully rededicated the temple to the God of Israel.
And they celebrate for 8 days.
They do.
And that triumphant 8-day festival of rededication is the historical origin of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights.
It is. And what's fascinating here is how deeply this historical moment reverberates into the New Testament.
So.
Well, the rededication of the temple wasn't just a minor cultural holiday. It was a profound theological statement about God's preservation of his sanctuary. If you turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 22, the text explicitly notes that Jesus is walking in the temple colonnade in Jerusalem during the Feast of Dedication. It is winter. He is literally there for Hanukkah.
That feels incredibly intentional by the author of the Gospel. It's not just giving us a weather report or a calendar date.
No, the author of John is brilliant at establishing theological mechanisms. He places Jesus exactly at the festival that celebrates the purification and miraculous preservation of the physical temple from pagan destruction.
Right.
And he does this right as Jesus is facing intense opposition from the religious leaders, right as he is revealing himself as the unique Son of God. The implication is staggering.
The implication being that Jesus is the new temple.
Exactly. The physical temple, which had to be constantly defended, cleansed, and rebuilt by human hands like Judas Maccabeus, is ultimately temporary. Jesus is subtly pointing to himself as the true, undefiled locus of God's presence.
He is the ultimate temple that, even if destroyed, will be raised up in 3 days.
Precise.
It's a brilliant theological layering. But I want to push back on the historical narrative for a moment.
Okay, go for it.
We have the soaring underdog story, right? The oppressed priests flee to the hills, they fight a righteous guerrilla war, they beat the massive empire, they cleanse the temple, and we get the beautiful festival of Hanukkah. It feels like a perfectly clean, righteous victory.
It does sound like a movie ending.
Right. But history is rarely that neat. What actually happens to the Maccabees after they win? Does this zealous religious family just go back to being humble priests?
This raises an important question, and the answer is honestly one of the most sobering lessons of the entire Second Temple period.
The Hasmonean paradox.
Yes, the Hasmonean paradox. Because the aftermath of the Maccabean revolt is exceptionally dark and messy. The family of Mattathias, who come to be known as the Hasmonean dynasty, doesn't just stop at securing religious freedom.
Because freedom is hard to keep.
Exactly. They realize that to protect their religious freedom, they need political autonomy. And to protect political autonomy, they need military power.
So the goalposts shift. It goes from let us worship in peace to we need to secure the borders.
Precisely. By 142 BCE, under the leadership of Judas's brother Simon Thassi, the Hasmoneans negotiate full political independence from the weakening Seleucid Empire. So for a brief window, Judea is a sovereign nation again, not ruled by a foreign king.
Which sounds great on paper.
But here's the mechanism of the paradox. As the Hasmoneans consolidate their power, as they focus on statecraft, taxation, and military expansion, they begin to morph into the exact kind of Hellenistic despots they originally fought against.
They become what they hated. How does that manifest practically?
It manifests through aggressive imperialism and internal violence. Take John Hyrcanus, who was Simon's successor. He builds a mercenary army and starts expanding Judea's borders through conquest.
Conquest? I thought they were just defending themselves.
Not anymore. He marches into the neighboring territory of Idumea and forces the entire population to convert to Judaism and be circumcised at certain point.
Wait, really? Forced circumcision by a Jewish ruler?
Mhm.
That is the exact mirror image of Antiochus Epiphanes outlawing circumcision.
It is, and he marches north and completely destroys the rival temple of the Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. He is using the religion of the Torah as a tool of violent imperial expansion.
The psychological whiplash for the deeply religious Jews watching this happen must have been severe.
Oh, it was devastating, and the institutional decay only accelerates. By the time you reach a later Hasmonean king named Alexander Jannaeus, who ruled in the early 1st century BCE, the disconnect between piety and power is absolute.
He's the one who was basically a warlord.
Yes, he is a brutal, paranoid warlord. The internal division is so bad that a massive civil war erupts between the Hasmonean king and his own people. At one point, the deeply religious faction known as the Pharisees actually invite a foreign Seleucid army into Judea to help them overthrow their own Jewish king.
Wait. The very people who trace their spiritual lineage back to the Maccabees, who resisted the Seleucids, are now asking the Seleucids to help them fight the descendants of the Maccabees.
Yes, it is a stunning irony. And when Alexander Jannaeus eventually crushes the rebellion, his retribution is horrific.
What does he do?
The historical sources record that he hosted a lavish banquet with his concubines, and for entertainment, he ordered 800 of his political opponents, mostly Pharisees, to be crucified alive in the center of Jerusalem.
Oh my God.
And while they were dying on the crosses, he had their wives and children slaughtered before their eyes.
That is horrific. And it completely shatters the romanticized view of this era.
The sources demand that we look at this objectively. The Hasmonean dynasty started with a father willing to die rather than compromise the law of God, and within a few generations, his descendants were crucifying their own countrymen to maintain political power.
The mechanism at play here is that religious institutions can become deeply, violently corrupt when they detach themselves from the underlying piety that founded them.
Exactly. When freedom becomes an end unto itself, rather than a means to serve covenant fidelity, it inevitably transforms into tyranny.
Wow. Okay, so if the Hasmoneans became these wealthy, corrupt, imperial rulers, treating Jerusalem like their own personal Hellenistic capital, they must have left physical evidence of that power, right?
Absolutely.
Because we've been talking entirely about texts and historical accounts so far. But do we see this shift in the dirt? When archaeologists dig down to the 1st and 2nd century BCE layers, do they find the remnants of this massive state?
We absolutely do. The archaeology of the Second Temple period provides the concrete mechanism that grounds all of these literary narratives. We are not just dealing with myths here. We are dealing with a heavily fortified, highly complex ancient society. And the archaeological footprint they left behind is staggering.
Give me an example of the kind of state infrastructure we are talking about. How do we know the Hasmoneans were building an empire?
Look at the military architecture. Just recently, in a major 2025 excavation in the heart of Jerusalem, archaeologists uncovered a massive, sweeping section of a Hasmonean fortification wall.
Like a city wall.
Yeah, but this wasn't a hastily thrown-together barricade. This was monumental architecture, engineered to withstand siege engines. It proves that during the era following the Maccabean revolt, Jerusalem wasn't just a religious center, it was a heavily fortified, heavily funded military capital of an independent state.
So they were taxing the trade routes, pooling immense resources, and building defenses on a scale that rivaled their Hellenistic neighbors.
Precisely. But as we know, the Hasmonean independence doesn't last, because eventually that massive superpower we mentioned earlier, Rome, finally turns its full attention to the eastern Mediterranean.
Right. Rome decides it's time to take over the land bridge.
Yes. The Roman Republic marches in. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey the Great intervenes in a civil war between two rival Hasmonean brothers. Pompey marches his legions right into Jerusalem, slaughters the defenders on the Temple Mount, and famously walks right into the Holy of Holies.
The innermost sanctuary of the temple where only the high priest was allowed to go.
Exactly. He is reportedly baffled to find that there is no physical statue of a god inside. But his invasion fundamentally ends Jewish independence. Judea is now officially a vassal of Rome.
And Rome doesn't want the headache of micromanaging this rebellious mountain province themselves. So they eventually install a local client king to rule it for them, a man named Herod the Great.
Herod the Great, who reigns from roughly 37 to 4 BCE. He is one of the most complex, brilliant, and terrifying figures in ancient history.
He's the one from the Christmas story.
He is. Now, he is technically Jewish by religion, but his family background is Idumean.
Wait, Idumean? As in, the very people that the Hasmonean John Hyrcanus had forcibly converted decades earlier.
The very same. So Herod is deeply insecure. He is viewed by the Jewish populace as an illegitimate half-breed usurper, completely dependent on the backing of the Roman legions to stay in power.
So how does a universally despised, paranoid king try to secure his legacy and legitimize his rule?
He builds. He builds on a scale that almost defies ancient engineering. Herod was an absolute architectural genius. He heavily utilized newly developed Roman engineering techniques like hydraulic pozzolana concrete that could cure underwater to completely reshape the landscape. His mechanisms for control were physical monuments.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you go to Israel today and look at the most famous archaeological sites, you are usually looking at Herod's work.
You really are.
Let's talk about his building projects, because they define the physical world Jesus will eventually walk through.
Well, his crowning achievement, ironically for a man who wasn't deeply pious, was the total renovation and expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
Right, because he wanted to win over the Jewish people.
And he wanted to build a temple that would rival the greatest shrines in the Roman world. So he essentially leveled the top of Mount Moriah, built massive monolithic retaining walls.
Of which the famous Western Wall is the surviving section today, right?
Exactly. And he created a sprawling, monumental platform that was the largest religious site in the ancient world. The sanctuary itself was covered in so much gold that the ancient historian Josephus claimed that looking at it in the midday sun would blind you.
It's just wild. But he didn't just build for the Jewish God. He built to appease his Roman masters, too.
Very much so. He constructed the entirely new, ultra-modern port city of Caesarea Maritima right on the Mediterranean coast.
Using that imported Roman concrete you mentioned.
Yeah, he used that ash concrete to build massive artificial breakwaters directly into the open ocean, creating a deep water port where natural geography didn't even provide one.
He just forced the ocean to submit.
He did. He built a Roman theater, a hippodrome, and a massive temple dedicated to the goddess Roma and the Emperor Augustus, visible to ships approaching the harbor. He was signaling to Rome, "I am your loyal, civilized servant."
And simultaneously, driven by his intense paranoia of rebellion, he built massive fortress palaces out in the desolate Judean desert.
Places like Masada and the Herodium, places he could flee to if the populace ever rose up against him.
So the architectural landscape is a literal manifestation of the political tension. You have a massive glittering temple funded by a paranoid, murderous client king who's completely beholden to a pagan empire.
It's a massive contradiction built in stone.
But the archaeology of this period gives us another crucial perspective. We don't just find the monumental architecture of the corrupt elites. We also find the remnants of the people who absolutely rejected that entire system.
Yes.
And we cannot talk about Second Temple archaeology without diving deeply into the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, absolutely. The Dead Sea Scrolls are, without hyperbole, the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century regarding the biblical text and the Second Temple period.
Set the scene for us. When and where were they found?
Between 1947 and 1956, Bedouin shepherds and archaeologists discovered tens of thousands of manuscript fragments hidden in 11 caves near a site called Qumran. This is situated in the arid, desolate cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea.
And these date back to when?
These manuscripts date from roughly the 3rd century BCE up to the 1st century CE.
Okay, so to understand the mechanism of why this was such a monumental earthquake in the academic world, we have to look at how we transmit ancient texts. Because before the discovery of Qumran, the oldest complete Hebrew manuscript of the Old Testament that we possess was the Leningrad Codex.
Right, which dates to roughly 1008 CE.
1008 CE. So we basically had to trust that medieval scribes had accurately copied the texts generation after generation for thousands of years. We had a 1,000-year gap in our physical evidence.
And the discovery of the scrolls instantly bridged that gap. It was like unearthing a perfectly preserved 2,000-year-old data backup of the Hebrew scriptures.
Oh, I love that analogy, a data backup.
They found fragments of every single book of the Hebrew Bible, with the exception of the book of Esther. But the crown jewel of the discovery was found in Cave 1, the Great Isaiah Scroll.
Let's focus on that scroll. How exactly did it prove the reliability of the texts we have today?
Well, the Great Isaiah Scroll dates back to approximately 125 BCE. That is over a century before Jesus was born, and a full 1,000 years older than the Leningrad Codex.
It's just staggering to think about.
It is 24 feet long, consisting of 17 sheets of parchment sewn together, and it contains all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And when scholars painstakingly laid the text of this ancient scroll next to the medieval manuscripts from a millennium later, the results were staggering.
They match.
The texts were virtually identical. I mean, there were minor spelling variations, shifts in grammatical style, and occasional slipped words, but the theological content, the prophecies, and the core message were meticulously preserved.
Which proves what?
It proved that the Jewish scribal mechanisms for transmitting sacred texts were incredibly rigorous. They weren't playing a loose game of telephone over the centuries. They were treating the text as the very breath of God.
We hear stories of scribes having to count every single letter in a scroll, knowing which letter was the exact center point, and literally burying the entire scroll if a single mistake was made.
He's an absolute obsession with preservation.
But Qumran wasn't just a library for biblical texts. They found other writings there too, right? Rules, commentaries, apocalyptic visions. Who were the people actually hiding these scrolls in the caves?
The consensus among most scholars is that the site of Qumran was inhabited by a deeply ascetic, ultra-strict Jewish sect, heavily believed to be the Essenes.
And why are they living in caves by the Dead Sea instead of in Jerusalem?
The mechanism that drove them into the desert is crucial to understand. They looked at the Hasmonean kings taking over the high priesthood. They looked at the corruption in Jerusalem. They looked at Herod expanding the temple with Roman money. And they concluded that the entire establishment was profoundly defiled.
They thought the mainstream temple system was apostate.
Completely apostate. So they withdrew.
They geographically separated themselves to maintain absolute purity.
Exactly. They built a remote community centered around intense ritual bathing in mikvehs, communal meals, and an obsessive around-the-clock study and copying of the scriptures.
But they are the ones writing the sectarian documents.
Yes. Their own sectarian documents, like the community rule, reveal a group that believed they were the true, pure remnant of Israel. They believed they were living in the final days, preparing the way in the wilderness for a cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness.
They were intensely waiting for God's dramatic apocalyptic intervention.
Very intense waiting, yes.
If we look at the contrast here, it is absolutely jarring. On one hand, you have a paranoid, incredibly wealthy Roman client king, Herod, importing Italian concrete to build colossal monuments to himself and the emperor right in the capital city. Splendor without an ounce of righteousness.
Right?
And on the other hand, you have the Essenes out in the blistering desert, copying scrolls by candlelight, taking ritual baths, and starving themselves to maintain a state of perfect purity. It perfectly maps the fractured, deeply divided, almost schizophrenic social landscape that Jesus was born into.
That is a brilliant way to frame it, and that extreme physical and political pressure, the violence of Antiochus, the corruption of the Hasmoneans, the taxation of Rome didn't just leave behind ruined walls and buried scrolls. It functioned as an incredible intellectual catalyst.
It sparked a massive literary explosion.
Yes, a linguistic and theological revolution that would eventually provide the architecture for the early Christian movement.
This brings us to the literature of the era. Because when your nation is constantly being squeezed by empires, when your religious identity is being threatened with absolute extinction, you don't just sit there. And you don't just fight with swords.
No, you're right.
You write to remember who you are, to make sense of the suffering and to instruct the next generation on how to survive.
The sociologists and literary scholars in our source material refer to the Jewish literature of this period as crisis response writing.
Crisis response.
Yes, we are looking at a vast corpus of texts here. The Apocrypha, historical works like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, wisdom literature like Sirach, and the intense rise of apocalyptic literature like the books of Enoch and Daniel. We have to understand that this isn't just dry academic theology being debated by comfortable philosophers.
This is a survival manual for a people under existential threat.
Exactly.
How does a text function as a survival manual? What is the mechanism there?
The texts provide a structural coherence to a chaotic world. So when the physical temple in Jerusalem is threatened with defilement or destruction, the literature responds by heavily stressing internal holiness, prayer, and the localized study of the law.
Internalizing the temple.
Exactly. When the covenant identity is under assault by Hellenization and the pressure to assimilate, the texts stress absolute, uncompromising devotion to the Torah. When foreign kings like Antiochus rage and seem completely invincible, the apocalyptic texts pull back the curtain to stress God's ultimate sovereign control over the timeline of history.
The literature is designed to anchor the psychology of the people.
It gives them a reason to hold on.
Let's actually trace the mechanics of this through some of the specific foundational texts of the era. Let's start with the book of Daniel, specifically the visions in chapters 7 through 12.
Daniel is the foundational blueprint for understanding how apocalyptic literature functions under pressure. Now, we should acknowledge the debate in our sources regarding the text's origin.
Right, the dating debate.
Yeah, traditional evangelical interpretation often treats Daniel as genuinely predictive, composed during the 6th century BCE Babylonian exile. Conversely, critical scholarship generally argues that the final form of these apocalyptic chapters was compiled during the 2nd century BCE, right in the crucible of the Antiochus V crisis between 167 and 164 BCE.
But here is the critical insight.
Yeah.
Regardless of the dating mechanism one accepts, the theological function of the text operates in the exact same way for the Jewish person reading it while under the boot of an empire.
Absolutely.
Which is to do what? Like, how does reading about weird visions help a family hiding from Seleucid soldiers?
It reframes their suffering. In Daniel chapter 7, the visionary sees a succession of terrifying, mutated beasts rising out of the chaotic sea. A winged lion, a bear, a four-headed leopard, and a terrifying fourth beast with iron teeth.
Sounding very much like the Parade of Empires we talked about.
Because it represents the violent, chaotic succession of human empires: Babylon, Persia, Greece. To a Jewish reader, the message is clear. Yes, the empires are monstrous, and yes, they are currently crushing us. But then, the vision shifts.
The Ancient of Days.
Yes, the Ancient of Days takes his throne in heaven, the court sits in judgment, the beast is slain, and everlasting dominion is handed over to one like a son of man, a heavenly representative of God's holy people.
So the mechanism of the text is to expand the timeline. It tells the reader, do not despair because of what is happening right now in the streets of Jerusalem. These kings will fall. History is not a random sequence of violent conquests. It is a controlled narrative moving toward God's final eschatological judgment.
Exactly. It guarantees that faithfulness under the crushing weight of empire will ultimately be vindicated by God's victory.
But this raises a profound, agonizing question. If God is going to eventually win, what happens to the righteous people who are brutally tortured and killed by the empire before that victory arrives?
That is the million-dollar question.
If you die for the covenant today, does God's justice simply fail you?
That is the ultimate crisis of faith. And nowhere is that crisis addressed more vividly or more tragically than in the historical account found in 2 Maccabees chapter 7.
We have to dive deeply into this story because it represents a massive paradigm shift in how the ancient world understood justice.
The narrative of 2 Maccabees 7 is arguably one of the most critical texts for understanding the theological mutation of the Second Temple period. It recounts the story of a Jewish mother and her 7 sons who are arrested during the persecution of Antiochus IV.
The one who banned all the Jewish practices.
Right. The king attempts to force them to eat swine's flesh, which was strictly forbidden by the dietary laws of the Torah. It is a calculated test of loyalty. Break the law of your God or suffer the wrath of the king.
And one by one, from the oldest to the youngest, the sons refuse. And I have to say, the text is incredibly difficult to read.
It is brutal.
It details how the king orders his torturers to cut out their tongues, scalp them, cut off their hands and feet, and literally fry them alive in giant pans.
all while the mother and the surviving brothers are forced to watch.
The visceral, unspeakable horror of this scene is meant to shock the reader to their core. But the theological leap, the real mechanism of the story, occurs in what the sons shout at the king right before they die.
They do not simply ask God to avenge their blood. They introduce a staggering theological assertion. As the second son is dying, he looks at Antiochus and says, "You accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life because we have died for his laws."
And the fourth son says something similar, right?
Yes, the fourth son says, "One cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals and to cherish the hope God gives of being raised again by him."
That is a massive structural shift in theology. In the older texts of the Hebrew Bible, the afterlife is frequently described really as Sheol.
Right, this shadowy, vague, dusty place of the dead where both the good and the wicked go.
There isn't a highly developed concept of individual bodily resurrection. But here, the extreme pressure of the crisis forces a new revelation of God's character.
The logic is inescapable to them. If God is perfectly just, and if these young men are being brutally murdered specifically because they're perfectly righteous in keeping his laws, then God's justice cannot possibly end at the edge of the grave.
Because if the grave is the end, then Antiochus wins, and God is not just.
Therefore, the mechanism of divine justice demands that God reverse death itself. He must physically resurrect the righteous martyrs to vindicate their obedience.
It cements the pre-Christian hope for a bodily resurrection. The Greek word used in the literature is anastasis. They aren't hoping to become disembodied spirits playing harps. They're hoping for their actual physical bodies to be restored in a renewed creation.
And this concept becomes the absolute bedrock for texts in the New Testament, like Hebrews chapter 11, which explicitly references people being tortured and refusing release so that they might gain a better resurrection.
It's all connected.
It is. And while the apocalyptic texts and the stories of the martyrs aim to secure the people's hope for the future, other texts during this period function to anchor their intellect and daily lives in the present.
So
We see this brilliantly executed in the wisdom literature, specifically in the book of Sirach, chapter 24.
Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus.
Oh.
This was written by a Jewish scribe named Ben Sira around the 180 to 175 BCE, right? So right before the Antiochus crisis really hit its peak. What is he trying to accomplish?
Ben Sira is acutely aware of the intellectual allure of Hellenism. In the broader ancient Mediterranean, wisdom in Hebrew, Chokmah, and in Greek, Sophia was heavily idealized.
The Greeks loved debating universal, abstract philosophical wisdom in the gymnasium and the Stoa.
They obsessed over it. So a young, educated Jewish man living in Jerusalem or Alexandria might feel incredibly tempted to abandon the seemingly archaic, localized laws of his ancestors in order to pursue the high-status universal philosophy of the Greeks.
You just blend in with the cool kids.
Exactly. So Sirach chapter 24 employs a brilliant defensive mechanism against this. He takes the cosmic, eternal concept of wisdom, personifies her, and explicitly identifies her with the Torah of Moses.
Oh, wow. So he is essentially telling the Jewish people, you are looking out at the Greek world, envying their philosophers, thinking you need to assimilate to find ultimate truth. But the cosmic wisdom that holds the entire universe together actually pitched her tent in Israel.
Yes.
You already have the highest philosophy in the world, and it is the book of the law.
It is a phenomenal intellectual survival tactic. Sirach argues that the fear of the Lord, lived out publicly by strictly observing the Torah, is the truest and highest form of wisdom available to humanity. It intellectually inoculates the Jewish reader against the temptation of Hellenistic philosophy.
Now, all of this crisis response writing is vital for the people living in Judea dealing with the Seleucids or the Hasmoneans. But what about the massive Jewish diaspora?
People outside the homeland.
Yeah. Because of centuries of empire, exile, and economic migration, there are huge populations of Jewish people living far outside Judea. Places like Alexandria in Egypt had hundreds of thousands of Jewish residents. And culturally, these diaspora communities were heavily assimilated into the Hellenistic operating system.
They spoke Greek, they traded in Greek, their civil rights were debated in Greek.
Which presents a profound, slow-moving crisis. By the 3rd century BCE, a significant portion of the Jewish diaspora in Alexandria could no longer read or speak ancient Hebrew. The language of their ancestors was becoming a dead language to them.
The mechanism of their identity, the public reading of the Torah, was breaking down because they couldn't understand the words.
Right. So how do you maintain a covenant identity centered on a text if your entire population cannot read the text?
You translate it. And that translation project becomes one of the most consequential events in human history.
Let's talk about it.
Beginning in the 3rd century BCE and continuing over the next century, Jewish scholars in Alexandria undertook the monumental task of translating the entire Hebrew scripture into Koine Greek.
The common Greek.
Yes. This translation is known as the Septuagint, commonly abbreviated with the Roman numerals LXX, referring to the legend that 70 or 72 scholars produced it.
Now, translating a sacred text is never just swapping out dictionary words, right? It involves massive conceptual leaps.
Oh, it's incredibly difficult.
You are taking a Hebrew language that was forged by nomadic herdsmen in the ancient Near East, a language full of agrarian, concrete idioms, and you're trying to map it onto Greek, a language designed by philosophers in Athens for abstract, precise, universal thought. How did they manage to find Greek equivalents for deeply Hebrew concepts without accidentally adopting pagan Greek theology?
That was the genius of the Alexandrian translators. They had to effectively hijack the Greek language.
Hijack it.
Yeah, let's look at a mechanism of translation. Take the Hebrew word kahal, which simply means the assembly or congregation of the Israelites gathered before God. The translators needed a Greek equivalent. They chose the word ecclesia.
Okay, ecclesia.
Now, in the classical Greek world, an ecclesia was simply a civic voting bloc of free citizens in a city-state gathering to discuss politics. But the translators stripped the word of its pagan civic connotations and loaded it with deep, covenantal Jewish meaning.
They preloaded the Greek language with Jewish theology.
Exactly, and they did this with hundreds of concepts. The Hebrew Mashiach, anointed one, became the Greek Christos. The Hebrew Torah instruction became the Greek nomos law.
I know some modern observers might look at the Septuagint and argue that it was a massive compromise, like a surrender of their sacred, unique language to the colonizing empire.
Some do say that.
But history proves that it was not a compromise. It was an incredibly strategic, divine setup.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the biblical narrative, the translation of the Septuagint is the runway being paved for the New Testament.
Just think about the world the Christian apostles are about to step into in the 1st century. Greek is the lingua franca of the entire Roman Empire. It is the English of the ancient world. You can travel from Spain to Syria, and if you speak Koine Greek, you can be understood.
Without the Septuagint, the early Christian movement would have been severely geographically and linguistically bottlenecked in Judea.
They wouldn't have been able to communicate the concepts.
Right. But because of the translation work done during these silent years, when the Apostle Paul goes on his missionary journeys to places like Ephesus or Corinth or even Rome, he doesn't have to spend decades translating the Old Testament into the local dialect.
He just walks right in.
He walks into a local synagogue, unrolls a scroll of the Septuagint, and preaches the gospel using a Greek Bible that the diaspora Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles already deeply understand.
The vocabulary for the Christian gospel was literally engineered by Jewish scholars in Egypt 200 years before Jesus was born. Words like Christ, church, justification, glory, they were already preloaded into the global language. God was using the cultural pressure of Hellenism to build the exact communication network needed for the rapid expansion of the early church.
And this brings us to the culmination of our deep dive. We have covered the relentless march of the empires, the breaking point of the Maccabean revolt, the corruption of the Hasmoneans, the buried scrolls at Qumran, the massive architectural footprints of Herod, and the linguistic revolution of the Septuagint.
That's a lot to take in.
It is. But all of these distinct mechanisms are converging. The 400 years weren't a gap, they were an incubator.
An incubator is the perfect way to describe it. It was a high-pressure furnace where the raw materials of Old Testament religion were smelted, refined, and forged into the precise sociological and theological shapes of Second Temple Judaism. And as we look at how the stage was set, we have to look at the fundamental shift in how the average Jewish person interacted with God on a daily basis. Because the religion of King David in the Old Testament looks practically very different than the religion of Peter the fisherman in the New Testament.
The key sociological shift involves decentralization. For a massive portion of this period, the Jewish people didn't have a king of their own on the throne. Furthermore, many lived thousands of miles away from Jerusalem in the diaspora, and even those in Judea frequently viewed the temple priesthood as hopelessly corrupt or overly Hellenized.
Like the Essenes did.
Exactly. So what is the mechanism that holds the community together? They pivot to the text. The Torah becomes the absolute portable center of Jewish identity.
And because you can't walk to the temple in Jerusalem every Sabbath to offer a sacrifice, a new local institution has to emerge to facilitate this text-centric devotion.
This is the genius of the synagogue. The synagogue is arguably the most important institutional development of the intertestamental period.
Where did it even come from? It's not in the Old Testament.
It began as a localized gathering place, a community center for prayer, dispute resolution, and most crucially, the public reading and teaching of the scriptures. It was a decentralized, highly resilient mechanism for maintaining covenant loyalty under imperial rule.
So if the Romans destroyed the temple, the faith would survive.
Because the synagogue network was already fully operational. By the time Jesus begins his ministry, the text tells us that it was his deeply ingrained custom to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath to teach.
That entire infrastructure of local rabbis, scribes, and weekly scripture readings was entirely built during the silent years.
It was.
So what does this all mean? We've traced the history, the archaeology, the literature, and the sociology. How does this incubator ultimately prepare the way for the specific events of the New Testament?
It culminates in an atmosphere of electrified, almost unbearable psychological expectation.
People were waiting.
This is the absolute climax of the Second Temple period.
Yeah.
Think about the redemptive historical arc of the Bible from the perspective of a first-century Jew sitting in a synagogue in Galilee. They know the grand story. Creation, the fall, the promise to Abraham, the rescue from Egypt, the glorious kingdom of David, and then the tragic, devastating exile to Babylon due to their sin.
The period they are currently living in represents a state of restoration, in part, but ultimately a state of waiting.
Yes, they are technically back in the physical land, but they are not sovereign. They have a physical temple, but it's overseen by a paranoid Idumean client king backed by pagan Roman legions.
They have the Torah, but they are painfully aware that the grand cosmic promises of the prophets of a world transformed by peace, of a new heart, of the Spirit being poured out, have not yet been consummated.
And specifically, they are intensely waiting for the king. Because there had been no rightful Davidic heir sitting on the throne in Jerusalem for 600 years, the longing for a Messiah, the Mashiach, the anointed deliverer, became electric.
And the pressure of the era caused different factions to develop wildly different expectations of how this Messiah would operate,
Yeah.
right?
Break down those competing expectations for me. Because Jesus steps into a world where everyone is looking for something slightly different.
Right. Well, the psychological landscape was incredibly fractured. The Pharisees, studying the law in the synagogues, were hoping for a Messiah who would be an ultimate authoritative teacher of the Torah, one who would bring perfect purity to Israel.
Okay.
The Zealots, remembering the glory days of Judas Maccabeus, were desperate for a military hammer, a warrior king who would literally slaughter the Roman legions and violently liberate Jerusalem.
Another Judas the Hammer.
Exactly. And then the Essenes out at Qumran were anticipating a dual messianic figure, a king and a pure priest who would fight an apocalyptic war and cleanse the defiled temple system.
They all knew that human politics, whether Hasmonean or Roman, had utterly failed them. Deliverance had to be a divine intervention.
And the intertestamental period provided these exact, highly developed theological categories.
And the staggering brilliance of the New Testament narrative is how Jesus completely frustrates the superficial political expectations of these groups, while simultaneously perfectly fulfilling the deeper theological categories they had developed.
Oh, that's so true. Let's trace these connections. Let's go back to the very first thing we talked about, the prophet Malachi, the last page of the Old Testament.
Malachi chapter 4 explicitly promises that God would send the prophet Elijah before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes.
And then, after 400 years of waiting, the Gospel of Mark opens. And stepping right out of the Judean wilderness is John the Baptist. He is intentionally wearing garments of camel's hair, eating locusts, and preaching a baptism of repentance.
He is visually and prophetically mirroring the ancient prophets. In the Gospels, Jesus explicitly confirms that John is the Elijah who was to come.
The massive mechanism of history was finally turning. The 400 years of waiting were not a delay. They were the precise preparation for the forerunner to step onto the stage.
And what about the temple? We've spent this entire time talking about the trauma surrounding the temple. Antiochus desecrating it with pigs, Judas Maccabeus cleansing it, Pompey massacring priests inside it, Herod expanding it into a Roman monument.
The physical building was the absolute center of anxiety and identity.
And then Jesus arrives. In John chapter 2, he stands right in the middle of Herod's magnificent, glittering, politically compromised temple courts. He flips the tables of the money changers, disrupting the economic mechanism of the sacrificial system.
And he makes a breathtaking declaration, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up."
The text notes that the authorities were baffled, but Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body.
He is claiming that he is the true temple.
Yes. He is declaring that the ultimate locus of God's presence, the place where heaven and earth finally meet, the sole place where true atonement for sins occurs, is no longer a localized stone building in Jerusalem that is constantly vulnerable to pagan armies.
It is him.
He embodies the temple. He is the ultimate, indestructible answer to the centuries of temple anxiety.
Wow. And finally, think about the trauma of the martyrs. We talked deeply about the mother and her 7 sons in 2 Maccabees, who chose to be tortured and executed rather than break the covenant, resting all their hope on the promise of a future bodily resurrection.
The crisis of the Second Temple era produced an entire profound theology of the righteous sufferer.
The understanding that a person could be completely obedient to God, deeply loved by God, and just be handed over to suffer brutal, unjust violence at the hands of the empire, trusting that God would ultimately vindicate them on the other side of the grave.
And Jesus steps directly into this category. He arrives as the ultimate, perfect, righteous sufferer. He is entirely innocent, perfectly obedient to the Father's will, yet he is brutally tortured and publicly executed by an unholy alliance of corrupt religious leaders and Roman imperial power.
But because he is the perfectly righteous one, the mechanism of divine justice demands that death cannot hold him. The anastasis, the physical bodily resurrection that the Maccabean martyrs hoped for as a future end-times event, is actually inaugurated and achieved in the middle of history by Jesus on Easter morning.
Jesus does not discard the theological vocabulary that Israel painfully developed during the intertestamental period. He steps into it and fills it to the brim.
He is the faithful Davidic king they lacked.
He is the pure, undefiled priest the Essenes wanted.
He is the true temple that cannot be desecrated.
He is the ultimate righteous sufferer, and he is the resurrected Lord.
When you lay it all out like that, it completely reframes how I view my Bible. The 400 silent years were a furnace. God wasn't absent. He didn't forget his people.
But first, second,
He was actively, sovereignly managing the geopolitical map, shifting empires, forging new linguistic networks in Alexandria, and deepening the theological framework of his people. Every empire that marched over that land bridge, every scroll carefully copied and hidden in a desert cave, every Greek word wrestled with by a translator, it was all meticulously setting the stage for the gospel.
as we summarize this incredible historical journey, it is vital to recognize that the Second Temple period is not just a fascinating academic exercise in ancient history.
No, it's not just trivia.
The mechanisms of this era speak directly and powerfully to you, the listener, today. We live in a world that sociologically feels remarkably similar to the Hellenistic period. We exist in pluralistic, highly mediated, hyper-connected global societies where the dominant cultural prestige, economic power, and political leverage are frequently not aligned with historic faith.
It's the border town analogy we started with. We are constantly feeling the pressure to download the new operating system to assimilate to whatever the dominant cultural empire demands in order to maintain our social standing or our livelihoods.
The intertestamental period asks a very modern, piercing question. How does faith actually survive under that kind of pervasive pressure? The Jewish people had to figure out how to navigate globalization, language translation, the allure of assimilation, and the demand for ultimate loyalty.
And they had different responses. Some resisted faithfully, holding onto the text.
Others tried to fuse their religious piety with ruthless political ambition and military power, and they became deeply corrupted, like the later Hasmonean kings.
That is not a dusty museum exhibit. That is a present-tense reality for anyone trying to live out deeply held convictions today. History warns us against the twin errors of quiet, cowardly cultural compromise on one side and coercive, forceful religious politics on the other.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've uncovered today. We started this journey by picturing that single, incredibly thin page between the Old and New Testaments, that perceived gap of 400 years that we are so quick to label as silent. We tend to do the exact same thing in the narrative of our own lives, don't we? We view periods of perceived silence, those long, agonizing times of waiting, seasons of intense, unexplained friction, or times when we lack a clear direction or a prophetic voice telling us exactly what the next step is, as wasted time.
We assume God has paused the tape.
We assume nothing of value is happening because we can't hear the dramatic declarations. But looking at the massive tectonic foundational shifts that occurred during the intertestamental period, what if the eras in your life where you feel God or the universe is the most aggressively silent are actually the exact times when the most crucial load-bearing work is being done behind the scenes?
The preparation in the dark.
Exactly. What if the intense, confusing pressure you are feeling right now is just the furnace required to forge the resilience, the new vocabulary, and the exact staging needed for your next chapter?